In October of 1987, at a farm liquidation sale outside of Grundy Center, Iowa, a 31-year-old woman named Della Reinhardt paid $40 for a 1968 Oliver I 6.5, that the auctioneer described, without visible enthusiasm, as a parts unit or a project, depending on your level of optimism. The block had a crack that someone had tried to seal with radiator stop leak sometime in the previous decade. The injection pump was frozen. Both rear tires were flat and had been flat long enough that the sidewalls had taken a permanent set against the rim flanges. There was a robin's nest in the air cleaner stack, which told you something about how long the stack had been sitting open to the sky. The seat was gone entirely, replaced at some point with a 5-gallon bucket wired to the platform, and the bucket had a hole in it. The scrap dealer from Marshalltown opened at $25 and dropped out at $30, which told you everything you needed to know about the machine's commercial prospects. Della bid $40. The auctioneer looked at her once, looked at the tractor once more, and said sold in a tone that suggested he was doing her a favor by letting the transaction end there. Her brother-in-law, Dale Reinhardt, was standing close enough to ask what she was going to do with it. Della said she'd figure something out. Dale told the story at the feed store in Grundy Center the following Monday, and by Wednesday it had reached the co-op east of town, and by Friday it was being discussed at the counter of the Grundy County Diner with the kind of cheerful disbelief that small farming communities reserve for decisions they find genuinely inexplicable. The consensus, such as it was, held that Della Reinhardt had paid $40 for a problem she didn't need, a machine that even the scrap man didn't want badly enough to follow through on, and that the whole business said something about what happened when a woman tried to run a farm operation without a man around to talk her out of bad ideas. That was the consensus. The consensus was wrong about nearly everything, but it would take the better part of a decade for the evidence to accumulate in sufficient quantity to make that clear. Let me tell you about Della Reinhardt, because what she did with that Oliver and what she built from it and what she proved with it only makes sense if you understand who she was and where the knowledge came from. Della was born in 1956 on a 240-acre operation in Grundy County, Iowa, the second of 4 children, and the only one who spent her childhood in her father's shop rather than the house. Her father was Eldon Reinhardt, and Eldon was a diesel mechanic of the particular kind that only exists in rural counties, where you fix what you have because what you need costs more than you have to spend on it. He had worked for 7 years at the Case dealership in Grundy Center before deciding he'd rather work for himself on his own equipment and his neighbor's equipment in a shop he built himself behind the farmhouse in 1961. The shop had a concrete floor he poured in 2 sections over 2 weekends, a tin roof, a wood stove in the northeast corner that he fed with hedgewood because hedge burned hot and slow and lasted through a February night, and a workbench along the south wall that he'd built from 2-inch oak planks he'd gotten from a demolished granary in 1958. The bench had a machinist's vise that he'd bought at a government surplus sale in 1953, still in the original grease, and a drill press he'd acquired in 1965 from a closed implement dealership in Iowa Falls. The tools on the pegboard above the bench were arranged by function, and had been arranged the same way for as long as Della could remember, which meant she could find a 3/8 combination wrench in the dark, and frequently did. Eldon's philosophy about equipment was simple, and he stated it often enough that his children could recite it. A machine you own outright is a machine that works for you. A machine with payments on it works for the bank, and you're just the one getting dirty. He applied this to the farm itself, which he had inherited from his own father in 1951, with a mortgage of $22,000, and had paid off by 1959 by farming it as hard as the soil would allow and spending almost nothing that didn't go directly back into the land or the equipment. By the time Della was old enough to follow him into the shop, the farm was free and clear and had been for years, and Eldon treated this fact not as an accomplishment to be celebrated, but as a baseline condition, the minimum acceptable arrangement between a farmer and his land. Della absorbed all of it, not because she was the most academically capable of the Reinhardt children, though she was, and not because she had no other options, though that was what people assumed. She had been accepted to the University of Northern Iowa in the fall of 1974 and had a suitcase packed and sitting by the door in late August when Eldon had his first heart episode, and the doctor in Grundy Center told the family in terms that left no room for interpretation that the man was not going to be farming at the same pace he'd been farming. Her brothers were already established elsewhere. Della unpacked the suitcase. She told her mother she'd go the following year. She didn't go the following year. She didn't go at all, and she never discussed this as a sacrifice or a loss, which was itself a thing worth noting. She took over the mechanical work on the farm gradually, and then completely. The way these things happen when someone is capable and available, and the alternative is paying for labor you can do yourself. By 1978, she was doing the annual overhauls on both the John Deere 402, and the International 5.6. Herself ordering parts from the dealer in town and doing the work in Eldon's shop on winter evenings after the day's chores were finished. She kept a ledger that tracked every part purchased, every hour spent, every dollar saved against the dealer's estimated labor rate. Not because she enjoyed bookkeeping, because the ledger told her the truth about her operation, and Della Reinhardt preferred truth to comfort. Eldon died in March of 1983. He left Della the farm, the shop, the tools, and a savings account at the Grundy County State Bank that held $41,000 accumulated over 30 years of spending less than he made. The farm was paid for. The equipment was paid for. There was no mortgage, no operating loan, no line of credit. There was a 240-acre farm in Grundy County, Iowa, a shop full of tools, $41,000 in the bank, and a 37-year-old woman who had learned everything her father knew and had been practicing it for the better part of a decade. That was what Della Reinhardt inherited. That was what the county thought it understood when it watched her bid $40 for a broken Oliver I 650 at a farm liquidation sale 4 years later. They thought they were watching impulse. They were watching the final step of a plan she'd been executing for 18 months. Here is what nobody at that auction knew. In April of 1986, 16 months before the liquidation sale, Della had driven to a farm equipment salvage yard outside of Ames and paid $65 for a 1971 Oliver 1650 engine that had been pulled from a machine that had rolled over a creek bank and bent the frame beyond repair. The engine itself was sound. She had checked the bores with a bore gauge she'd bought at a machinist's supply in Waterloo, measured the main bearing journals with a micrometer, and pulled the head to inspect the valves. The bores were within factory tolerance. The valves were worn but serviceable with a light lap. The crankshaft had no detectable runout. It was an engine that had been inside a dead tractor and had nothing wrong with it that a competent rebuild wouldn't fix. She had stored that engine in the back corner of Eldon's shop under a canvas tarp, and she had spent the following 16 months sourcing rebuild parts from 3 different suppliers, comparing prices, and waiting for the right machine to come available at the right price. The Oliver 1650 she needed was not the engine. She had the engine. What she needed was the platform. The transmission, the hydraulics, the axles, the sheet metal. She needed the rest of the tractor at a price that kept the total project cost below what she calculated as her threshold. When the liquidation sale notice appeared in the Grundy County paper in September of 1987, she read the equipment list twice, noted the 1968 Oliver 165, listed as a parts unit, and drove out to the farm the following Saturday to look at it before the auction. She spent 45 minutes underneath and around the machine with a flashlight and a pry bar. The frame was straight. The transmission case was uncracked. The rear axle housings were solid. The hydraulic pump was seized but rebuildable. The sheet metal was rough but present. She drove home and wrote down a number in her ledger, and the number was the maximum she was willing to pay, and the number was $60. She bid $40, and the scrap man quit at $30. She had room to spare and didn't need it. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing a woman who paid $40 for a broken tractor. They were watching a machinist's daughter execute the second step of a plan that had started a year and a half earlier in a salvage yard outside of Ames. Let me tell you about the rebuild, because this is where Della proved that the knowledge her father gave her was not sentiment. It was capital. She started in November of 1987, after the harvest was in, and the days had shortened enough that the shop work was the natural use of the dark hours. The first thing she did was pull the cracked block from the 1968 machine and set it outside the shop door. She would sell it for scrap in the spring and get $12 for it, which she noted in the ledger. Then she inventoried everything on the 1968 chassis that was usable. The transmission, which was sound once she drained the contaminated oil, and found no metal in the pan beyond the normal accumulation of wear particles. The rear axle assembly, which needed new seals and bearings on the left side where someone had let the oil run low. The hydraulic pump, which she disassembled on the workbench and found to have a scored pump body that she could have resurfaced on the surface plate her father had bought in 1969. The sheet metal, which she straightened cold with a body hammer and a dolly over 3 evenings. And the electrical system, which was mostly intact and needed only a new wiring harness from the injection pump forward. Then she pulled the canvas tarp off the 1971 engine in the corner and went to work. The engine rebuild took 6 weeks of evenings and 1 full weekend in January, when a cold front came through and dropped the temperature to 4 below, and she ran the wood stove hot enough that the shop held 50 degrees, and she worked in a heavy canvas shirt with the radio on the shelf above the drill press tuned to the WHO farm report out of Des Moines. She honed the bores herself with a rigid hone she'd borrowed from a machinist in Iowa Falls, who had been a friend of her father's. She lapped the valves by hand with valve grinding compound and a lapping stick, checking the seal with a marking die and a straight edge until every valve seat showed a continuous contact ring, not less than 1/16 of an inch wide. She replaced the main bearings and rod bearings with a set of standard size bearings she'd ordered from an Oliver parts supplier in Illinois. She replaced the head gasket, the valve stem seals, the timing cover gasket, and the rear main seal. She set the valve lash to factory specification with a feeler gauge and checked it twice. The parts for the engine rebuild came to $88. The transmission bearings and seals were $41 from a bearing supply house in Cedar Falls. The rear axle bearings and seals were $33. The hydraulic pump resurfacing she did herself on the surface plate, spending $11 on lapping compound and new O-rings. The wiring harness was $22 from an electrical supply in Waterloo. New injection lines, which she didn't trust on a machine that had sat open to weather, were $31. The fuel injection pump she had rebuilt by a diesel injection specialist in Des Moines, who charged her $55 and told her the pump was in better condition than most he saw from machines that had been running the previous week. New front tires were $48 for the pair. The rear tires she had pulled from the cracked block machine were sound, needed only to be inflated and balanced. Paint, primer, and sheet metal screws were $19. Miscellaneous hardware, filters, and fluids were $26. The 1968 Oliver 1650 chassis had cost her $40 at auction. The 1971 engine had cost her $65 at the salvage yard in April of 1986. The rebuild parts and supplies totaled $374. The total cost of the completed tractor was $479. She wrote that number in the ledger in February of 1988 when the tractor was done, and she underlined it once, which was the most demonstrative thing she did to mark the occasion. The new Oliver 1650 at the dealership in Grundy Center listed for $19,400. Let me tell you what happened when she took it to the field. It was the first week of March 1988, a dry week in a year that would turn out to be the driest in Grundy County since 1936, and Della needed to finish some fall-deferred tillage on the North 40 before the ground worked up too hard. She hooked the rebuilt 1650 to a 4-bottom plow, which was 1 bottom more than the old 4020 could handle on that ground without lugging, and pulled it the length of the field at a pace she later described in the ledger as satisfactory. The engine did not smoke. The hydraulics lifted and held without drift. The transmission shifted clean through all 6 forward gears. The rebuilt injection pump delivered fuel at a rate that the exhaust note told her was exactly right. A clean dark gray curl at the stack that cleared to nothing within 20 feet, which is what a properly timed diesel engine does under load. Her neighbor to the north, a man named Gerald Pokorny, who had farmed the adjacent quarter section for 30 years, and who had been among the people at the co-op who found the October auction purchase amusing, drove his pickup to the fence line on the second day and watched her make 3 passes. When she came back to the end nearest him, he got out of the truck. He walked to the fence. He took his cap off and held it in both hands and watched the tractor idle for a moment without saying anything. Then he asked what engine was in it. She told him. He asked where she'd gotten it. She told him that too. He looked at the machine for another moment, put his cap back on, and said that it sounded right. Della said it was. He nodded and got back in his truck. That was the whole conversation. But Gerald Pokorny told 3 farmers what he'd seen at the fence line, and those farmers told others. and the version of the story that circulated after March of 1988 was different in character from the version that had circulated after October of 1987. The first version had been a story about a bad decision. The second version was a story about something people had seen with their own eyes. If you have ever watched a community slowly and reluctantly revise what it thought it knew about someone, you know how this part of the story goes. Stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling, because I have more of them. Now let me tell you about what happened over the next several years, because this is where the story stops being about a tractor and starts being about something else entirely. You know what happened in the late 1980s in Iowa. You know what had been happening since 1981, when interest rates climbed to 18% and corn dropped below $2 a bushel, and land values in Grundy County fell by 40% in 3 years. You know what that combination did to farms that had been built on operating loans and equipment financing and land purchases made at 1979 prices, with 1979 optimism. By 1988, the Grundy County Courthouse had processed more farm foreclosures in the preceding 7 years than it had in the previous 4 decades combined. The feed store had lost 6 of its 15 largest accounts. The implement dealer had stopped stocking new machines in certain categories because the financing wasn't moving. Farms that had been in families for 3 and 4 generations were being sold at auction, and the prices they brought were not the prices anyone had expected when the loans were written. Della watched this from a farm with no mortgage, no operating loan, no equipment payments, and a tractor that had cost her $479. Her expenses didn't change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut because there had never been anything to cut. She bought her inputs with cash at the beginning of the season and sold her grain at harvest and put the difference in the savings account at the Grundy County State Bank. And the savings account grew by $4,000 to $6,000 most years, more in the good years, less in the dry ones. She watched her neighbors lose their operations, not because they were bad farmers, but because they had built their operations on borrowed money at borrowed prices. And when the prices fell and the rates held, the arithmetic stopped working, and the banks came for what the banks had always technically owned. She watched this with what people who knew her described as quiet sadness, not satisfaction. Not the particular pleasure that some people take in having been right when others were wrong. Sadness because she had grown up alongside these families, and she understood that the difference between her situation and theirs was not intelligence or effort or character. It was one decision made differently over and over again for 30 years. In the fall of 1989, the Pokorny quarter section came up for auction. Gerald Pokorny had held on longer than most. He had sold equipment, sold cattle, sold the back 20 acres of timber in 1987, and borrowed against the house to cover the operating note in 1988. It wasn't enough. The farm went to a liquidation auction in October, and the land, 160 acres of Grundy County ground, that had been in the Pokorny family since 1912, was offered in 2 parcels. Della Reinhardt was at that auction. She had driven herself in the farm truck, and she stood near the back of the crowd in a canvas jacket, with her hands in her pockets. When the bidding on the north parcel opened at $800 per acre, she waited. She let the bidding run up. When it reached $1,100 per acre and the 2 remaining bidders were a land investment company from Des Moines and a farm management firm out of Ames. She raised her hand and bid $1,150. The investment company came back at $1,200. She bid $1,250. The investment company paused, consulted with someone beside them, and dropped out. 80 acres of Grundy County farmland at $1,250 per acre, $100,000. She wrote a check from the Grundy County State Bank account, and the check cleared the following morning. The crowd at that auction went quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when something happens that requires them to rearrange everything they thought they knew about a situation. Not applause, not commentary, the particular silence of a group of people realizing simultaneously that they had been looking at something for years and had not understood what they were seeing. Dale Reinhardt, her brother-in-law, the man who had asked at the October 1987 auction what she was going to do with that broken Oliver, was standing 20 feet from her when she wrote the check. He didn't say anything to her at the auction. He called her that evening and told her their father would have understood exactly what she'd done. Della said she knew. That was the end of the conversation, and it was enough. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Eldon Reinhardt would have understood without a word of explanation. Della farmed the expanded operation through the 1990s, adding the Picorni ground to her existing 240 acres and working all of it with the rebuilt Oliver 1650 and the old John Deere 402, and a used combine she had bought in 1991 from a retiring farmer in Tama County for $3,200 and rebuilt in the shop over the winter in the same methodical way she'd rebuilt the Oliver. She kept the ledger the same way she'd always kept it. Every part, every hour, every dollar tracked against what the dealer would have charged for the same work. By 1995, the ledger showed that she had saved, through her own labor and her father's tools, and her habit of buying broken things and making them whole, an amount that she calculated at just over $62,000 against what she would have spent on dealer labor and new equipment at commercial prices. $62,000 that was not in a bank account because she had never spent it in the first place. The Oliver 1650 was still in the field in 1997, still on the original rebuilt engine. She had done a valve adjustment in the spring of 1993 and replaced the water pump in 1995, and that was the sum total of the mechanical attention the engine had required in 9 years of field work. It had 4,200 hours on the rebuilt engine by then, which is a number that speaks for itself to anyone who has owned a diesel tractor. Her niece, a girl named Clara, who was the daughter of her younger brother, and who had been coming to the farm every summer since she was old enough to be useful, started spending time in the shop at age 14 in the summer of 1994. Della taught her the same way Eldon had taught Della, by working alongside her and saying very little and letting the work explain itself. By the time Cora was 16, she could set valve lash, read a micrometer, and identify a diesel engine's condition by sound before the hood was ever opened. She knew where every tool on the pegboard above the bench belonged, because Della had arranged them the same way Eldon had arranged them. And Eldon had arranged them the same way his own father had arranged them in a different shop in a different county 40 years before that. In the summer of 1998, the Grundy County Farm Bureau invited Della to speak at their annual meeting. She was not a person who sought public occasions, and the people who knew her were mildly surprised that she accepted. She stood at the front of the meeting room at the Grundy Center Community Hall with her hands at her sides and spoke for about 8 minutes without notes. She said that she had been farming Grundy County ground for 20 years and had never carried a mortgage or an operating loan, and that this was not because she was smarter than her neighbors or luckier than her neighbors, but because her father had taught her that the only honest way to measure the cost of a thing was to count all of it, including the interest, including the years you'd be paying it, including what you'd have to sell if the price dropped before the loan was done. She said that she had bought a broken tractor for $40 in 1987 and rebuilt it for $439 more, and that it was still in her field and still working, and that the same tractor new would have cost $19,000 on a 5-year note at the rates that were available in 1987, and that if you ran those numbers out to the end of the note, you'd find that the tractor had cost closer to $24,000, and that $24,000 was the difference between writing a check for land and watching someone else buy it. She said that she had watched good farmers lose good land, not because they made bad decisions, but because they made normal decisions, the same decisions the bank recommended and the dealer recommended, and the agricultural extension office recommended. And that normal had turned out to mean borrowed, and borrowed had turned out to mean fragile, and fragile had turned out to mean gone when the pressure came. She said that her father had believed a paid-for tool was worth more than a new tool with payments on it, and that she had spent 20 years finding out he was right, and that she expected to spend the next 20 years finding out the same thing again. Then she sat down. Gerald Picorni was in the room. He had been renting back 40 of his original acres from Della since 1990 on terms she had set deliberately low, and he was farming a smaller operation now on ground. He was slowly buying back with the rent he wasn't paying on the rest. He didn't say anything to her after the speech, but when she walked past him on the way to the door, he nodded once, the kind of nod that carries the weight of everything that doesn't need to be said between two people who have been watching the same thing from different sides for a long time. Cora Reinhardt took over the day-to-day operation of the farm in 2003. The Oliver 1650 was still running. Eldon's shop was still standing. The concrete floor still sound. The wood stove still in the northeast corner. The machinist's vise still bolted to the oak workbench. The drill press Della had used to rebuild the injection pump housing in the winter of 1988 was still on its stand in the corner. The cutting oil still in the reservoir. The tools on the pegboard were still arranged the way they had always been arranged, which meant Cora could find a 3/8 combination wrench in the dark, and she did. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a broken tractor at a farm liquidation sale? The one with the cracked block and the frozen injection pump, and the robin's nest in the air cleaner, and the 5-gallon bucket where the seat used to be? Most people see $40 of scrap metal and a story to tell at the feed store on Monday morning. Della Reinhardt saw a frame that was straight, a transmission that was sound, a set of rear axle housings with good steel in them, and a platform that was worth exactly what she needed it to be worth to make the numbers in her ledger come out the way she'd already decided they were going to come out. That is the difference between someone who buys and someone who builds. $40 at auction, $439 in parts, a machinist's daughter in a paid-for shop with her father's tools. The tractor nobody wanted, in the hands of the woman nobody understood, until the day she wrote a check that the whole county heard in the silence that followed it.